Okay, so today we will be doing the second part of chapter 18, which is amino acid oxidation and production of urea. So in today's lecture, we will primarily be discussing about urea cycle. Okay, so let's go to the slide from where we can actually start today's lecture. And that would be this slide. You have seen this slide in the previous class, if you recall, right? And so once proteins are ingested, they are hydrolyzed into their components, amino acids, and amino acids are brought to the liver, as you know, because most of the amino acids are metabolized in the liver, right? And so they are brought into the liver and where they can be, they are transaminated with alpha ketoglutarate to generate glutamate and alpha keto acids, right? You also know that some other tissues, extra hepatic tissues, also can generate ammonia, right? And so in those tissues, excess ammonia, for example, from muscle cells, is brought in the form of alanine, right? They travel through the blood and they are brought to the liver again, and they are transaminated, right? With alpha ketoglutarate to generate pyruvate and glutamate. And some other tissues and sometimes metabolism of nucleotides, etc. Ammonia is generated and it is collected in the form of glutamine. And so glutamine then travels to the liver where it is converted to glutamate and ammonia by the enzyme glutaminase, if you recall. And so they are showing you all these nitrogen portion of the amino acid, which is amine, in pink. And eventually all those collected amines from the amino acids are taken to the urea cycle, right? And so with that, you also learned in the last class that glutamate is transported from the cytosol to mitochondria, where you have this enzyme glutamate dehydrogenase. Glutamate dehydrogenase is the only mammalian enzyme that can accept both NAD plus or NADP plus as an acceptor, electron acceptor. Okay. Typically, for plants and other species, and glutamate dehydrogenases are very specific, either for NAD plus or for NADP plus. But regardless, once glutamate is transported from cytosol to mitochondria, glutamate dehydrogenase will actually do oxidative deamination reaction, right? We'll take glutamate and use either NAD plus or NADP plus, and with intermediate, it converts glutamate to alpha ketoglutarate and ammonia. Cool. And so we also, if you recall, in many tissues such as brain, there are processes, there are metabolism of certain other molecules like nucleotide. And when nucleotides are, for example, degraded, they also generate toxic ammonia. And so in those tissues, toxic ammonia cannot just go free and cannot just come to the blood, to the liver, okay, for urea cycle. So that ammonia must be converted to non-toxic form before it enters the bloodstream, right, and goes to the liver. So there is an enzyme called glutamine synthetase. Synthetase means it will use ATP, and you can see it is actually utilizing ATP. So a glutamate will act as an acceptor of that toxic ammonia that was generated in tissues like brain, for example, from nucleotide degradation. So glutamine synthetase will actually take glutamate and ATP and ammonia and convert L-glutamate to L-glutamine. And L-glutamine, you can see, has that nitrogen from the ammonia that needed to be carried to the liver. So glutamine then enters the bloodstream and it comes to the liver. And in the liver mitochondria, you have the enzyme glutaminase that will basically take L-glutamine and hydrolyze it to generate again L-glutamate and ammonia. Ammonia is pushed into the urea cycle for excretion. Cool. So with that, we also discussed the glucose alanine cycle, and this is not to be confused with the Cori cycle. Remember the Cori cycle, where you have the lactate that is produced by the anaerobic oxidation of fuel in your muscle cells, right? Via glycolysis. Once you produce lactate, it basically moves to the liver, and in the liver, it is converted back to the glucose via gluconeogenesis, and then it is returned to the blood. Glucose is returned to the blood, and then it goes to the muscles, and then glucose can get metabolized, right? So lactate conversion to glucose is Cori cycle. This is called glucose alanine cycle, okay? And so it turns out that if we are doing, let's say, prolonged exercise, right? Or if we are starving, right? Or we are, our cells are metabolically starving because we have type 2 diabetes, for example, right? So either one of those conditions, we can use, our cells use branched chain amino acids as fuel. And so that would be, valine, isoleucine, leucine, etc. And so these amino acids will be metabolized in the muscle, but muscles don't have the capabilities to excrete nitrogen in the form of urea, right? So you need to actually bring that amine to the liver. And that's where this glucose alanine cycle helps out. Okay, so what happens? So you basically start out, you look here on the left-hand side, muscle proteins, you'll start to metabolize, right? Amino acids. And when the amino acids are metabolized, you will have the ammonia being collected in the form of glutamate, right? So how will that reaction will happen? It will be a transamination reaction of the amino acid with alpha-ketoglutarate, right? That's what will happen. So amino acids will transaminate with alpha-ketoglutarate, and you will generate glutamate and alpha-keto acid, right? So so now you have produced glutamate. So if you look here nicely, glutamate and pyruvate are the two substrates, okay? So muscles are actively carrying out glycolysis, so you can see that glucose will be getting converted to pyruvate. And so in the muscle cells, you have this enzyme called alanine aminotransferase, okay? Remember pyruvate and alanine. If you wrote the chemical structures of pyruvate and alanine, it will be very interesting. It's an alpha-keto acid, and then alanine is amino acid, corresponding amino acid, right? So pyruvate and glutamate will react with the help of alanine aminotransferase to produce alanine and alpha-ketoglutarate. And alanine is what actually goes into the blood, right? So you will have higher levels of blood alanine now going to the liver. Once alanine enters the liver, the same enzyme, alanine aminotransferase, now in the liver, will take alanine and do a transamination reaction with alpha ketoglutarate to generate pyruvate and glutamate. It's just the reverse reaction of muscles, right? And so again, that glutamate is now taken to the urea cycle. Remember glutamate dehydrogenase, what chemistry it does? That's what the arrow here is, glutamate to ammonia, right? That's the oxidative deamination reaction right there. But anyway, you know that already. So, but what happens to the pyruvate? Pyruvate, it turns out, gets converted to glucose again via gluconeogenesis, and glucose is released into the blood, and glucose goes to the muscle. So you can see glucose in the muscle and pyruvate in the liver, alanine in the liver. And that's one reason they call it glucose-alanine cycle. Glucose is entering the muscle cycle here, alanine is entering the liver. So alanine is actually just serving as a carrier of ammonia, right? And of the carbon skeleton of the pyruvate from the skeletal muscles to the liver. So it's bringing both carbon portion of the carbon skeleton, pyruvate, to the liver, right? Where pyruvate can be utilized and converted further to glucose, because rapidly contracting muscles would love to have some glucose for rapid contracting. Okay, so that's what glucose-alanine cycle is, okay? That now brings me to the main crux of this lecture, and which is urea cycle. Now, urea cycle, you can see the slide is very, very busy slide. And there is nothing better I can do than actually to tell you at every levels of, of reactions here, how beautifully ammonia is actually converted into urea for excretion, okay? So, it turns out that, if you pay attention, don't look at anything right now, but look at overall on slide on the right hand side. You can see that they are showing you mitochondrial matrix as well as the cytosol, right, of the liver. And so you see some reactions are happening inside the mitochondrial matrix and some are happening in the cytosol, okay? So, if you want to know upfront what are the reactions of urea cycle reactions are comprised of 4 individual reactions that are listed as 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, 1 happens in the mitochondrial matrix, number 1. And then the reaction number 2, 3, and 4 happens in the cytosol. Okay. The 4 reactions that are catalyzed here are done by these 4 enzymes. Okay, so 4 enzymes are ornithine transcarbamylase, which actually catalyzes reaction number 1, which is in the mitochondrial matrix. Reaction number 2 is argininosuccinate synthesis, which is catalyzed by argininosuccinate synthetase. Again, as name implies, you might think that you might have guessed already that this enzyme will need an ATP molecule, right? And the third reaction is argininosuccinase, where the molecule argininosuccinate is hydrolyzed. And then fourth is arginase, which again, hydrolysis of arginine to generate urea and ornithine. So those are the 4 steps. Step 1 is in mitochondrial matrix, and step 2, 3, and 4 happens in the cytosol. That's something that you should know. Those are the 4 reactions of urea cycle. If somebody asks you what are the reactions of urea cycle, you always say one of these 4 reactions, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? But to get to reaction number 1, you need to make an intermediate. Okay, that intermediate's name is carbamoyl phosphate. That is synthesized in the mitochondrial matrix. How is that done? I will show you in a bit, but that's the starting substrate of the urea cycle. So reaction number one is comprised of a reaction between carbamoyl phosphate. You can say it's a carbamate phosphoric acid anhydride and ornithine. Ornithine is very similar molecule. It's also an amino acid, but if you look carefully, you will see that it is one carbon short in its side chain. So it would be a lysine if there was another molecule of another, one of these CH2 group, methylene group, right, in the side chain. So it's a little bit one carbon short analog of lysine called ornithine, okay? And I hope that you can see that without any issues. So that's the reaction number first, reaction of ornithine with carbamoyl phosphate to generate this molecule called citrulline that happens inside the mitochondrial matrix. But let's first discuss what happens. How did we get there, right? So if you look here on the top right corner, right? They're actually showing that you are trying to bring, you know, glutamine, for example, from extrahepatic tissues. Remember, I was just telling you this, right? Right here, right? Glutamine synthetase reaction will do. So glutamine from extrahepatic tissues will travel to the liver because it has collected that amine, right? Remember in the side chain of this. So you will bring glutamine inside the mitochondrial matrix. And in mitochondrial matrix, you know that already there are two enzymes. One is glutaminase that will take glutamine and hydrolyze it to glutamate and ammonia. That's ammonia is shown here in the blue shade, right here. So yeah, you can understand, oh, that's that we already talked about that, right? When amino acids are brought to the liver, right, they do transamination reaction. We talked about that today and in the last class with alpha ketoglutarate to generate glutamate, right? That glutamate can also enter liver mitochondria, and that's what you are seeing here, glutamate in the center. So you also know that glutamate dehydrogenase is there in the mitochondrial matrix of the liver. So glutamate dehydrogenase will do its magic and convert glutamate to alpha ketoglutarate and ammonia. So now you can see those arrows are producing ammonia. Look, ammonia here is released in the mitochondrial matrix. Mitochondrial membrane is pretty cool. It can protect ammonia inside. It will not let it leak out. Okay, so that's perfect. It's bringing amine in non-toxic forms, bringing it into the liver mitochondria, and then the enzymes are actually converting free ammonia inside the mitochondrial matrix. You also know that alanine from muscles will be bringing amine, right, in the form of alanine. And that can also do transamination reaction with alpha ketoglutarate to generate glutamate, right? And in that case, what will be your alpha keto acid? Okay, I will let you do that on your own. But anyway, you will produce glutamate, right? When actually you do transamination reaction with alpha ketoglutarate and alanine. That glutamate also comes in. So those are the sources of ammonia, right? Coming into the liver mitochondrial matrix. So if you look here very carefully, this ammonia or ammonium ion, more formally speaking, is shaded in the blue. And if you look at the fourth reaction, the product of the fourth reaction at the bottom right, or rather in the center of the bottom, you see that urea, they are showing you one shade of nitrogen right there, amine. So one of that, that amine is shown here. But urea has two amine, right? NH2, NH2. The second amine comes from where? It turns out that the second amine comes from the mitochondrial matrix in the form of aspartate. What happens? Okay, so in mitochondrial matrix, you have oxaloacetate. Remember citric acid cycle? Yeah, oxaloacetate right here. It's another alpha keto acid. Oxaloacetate will do a transamination reaction with glutamate. Okay, so that enzyme is aspartate aminotransferase to produce aspartate and alpha ketoglutarate, alpha Kg. Again, glutamate and oxaloacetate will do a transamination reaction catalyzed by aspartate aminotransferase to generate alpha ketoglutarate and aspartate. And that aspartate molecule is shown here. Okay. So the same glutamate can get converted to alpha ketoglutarate and an ammonia, right? Yes. But it can also directly react with aspartate aminotransferase with the help of another substrate, oxaloacetate, to generate aspartate and alpha ketoglutarate. Okay. Very, very cool. But I would really ask you to write this reaction yourself, like literally draw the structure of glutamate, draw the structure of alpha ketoglutarate. You know, already you should know the structure of aspartate and oxaloacetate, right? So you have to understand that glutamate, that amine is coming from that glutamate, right? Because oxaloacetate is actually accepting that amine from glutamate by when the reaction that is catalyzed by aspartate aminotransferase. Cool? Okay, so that aspartate comes out of the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, there is a shuttle system here in the mitochondrial membrane called malate aspartate shuttle, which we will talk about it, I think, in the last class, which basically brings malate in and aspartate out. Okay, that's what malate aspartate shuttle, that's what it does. And I will come back to that. So you should remember, I talked about that. It's all very relevant, right? This is what connecting the dots mean in this class. So aspartate is brought out. Now let's go back and look at the reaction. When you produce this ammonium ion, an enzyme called carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1. Okay, synthetase. So, so that enzyme also likely uses ATP. It turns out that it uses two molecules of ATP, one molecule of bicarbonate and one molecule of ammonium ion or ammonia to generate carbamoyl phosphate. As I said, carbamoyl phosphate is a carbamate phosphoric acid anhydride, right? You can see it's an activated molecule. Carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1 is not part of the urea cycle enzyme, formally speaking. That's what I want to also emphasize here. But it is a very, very important enzyme that produces the substrate for the reaction number 1 of urea cycle. So ornithine and carbamoyl phosphate, they will come together in the ornithine transcarbamylase enzyme active site and produce citrulline. If you formally want to, again, not memorize and not worry too much about, not get too scared with the structure of citrulline, all you have to do is that you should be able to draw the structure of ornithine, which is same as lysine, but one carbon short in the side chain. and you see carbamoyl phosphate structure, right? So if you look here, carbamoyl phosphate structure and ornithine structure, you can see that ornithine amino group, side chain amino group, is forming a covalent bond with the carbonyl. That's all. And so that should be easy to write. Citrulline structure should now be very easy for you to write, because all you have to do is the leaving group is phosphate here, right? So amine with the help of a general base will actually get deprotonated, and in the form of NH2, it will attack that carbonyl, and then phosphate leaves and you have formed the citrulline molecule. Now, if you look here, citrulline, you can already see that its kind of terminal end is already built like urea, but it's not quite, okay? That's not how the reaction happens. Citrulline is then brought out to the cytosol, where it actually is utilized by this enzyme argininosuccinate synthetase, another enzyme that will use ATP as one of the substrate to generate argininosuccinate. So in this reaction, and I will show you this reaction at the molecular level, how it happens, but for now, just look at the citrulline structure, right? And you bring ATP, that carbonyl oxygen is attacking, O minus will attack the alpha phosphoryl group of ATP to generate this citrulyl AMP intermediate shown here in the parentheses. So if you really want to do arrow pushing, you can take that lone pair on the amine, and which is shaded in the blue, or the other one actually, and then delocalize it to form the double bond with the carbon shaded in yellow. And then you will have to push that O carbonyl double bond to O minus, and that O minus can now act as a nucleophile and attack the alpha phosphoryl group of ATP. Leaving group will be pyrophosphate, and then you generate citrulyl AMP intermediate as shown here. I'm telling you at a very molecular level, you know why? Because it's very easy to write this down if you are willing to take a little bit work and write the structures, okay? And so you don't have to write like sugar and base. You can just write, sugar and base, S and B, but as long as you know this is a phosphoryl bond, then you should be good to go, right? Phosphorus oxygen carbon bond. At that point, citrulyl AMP intermediate then reacts with the aspartate that was brought out via malate aspartate shuttle into the cytosol. So the reacting substrate for the reaction 2B, which is again part of the second reaction, is you take citrulyl AMP intermediate and aspartate, which is shown here, and make argininosuccinate. Again, if you look at this molecule very carefully, you can see that there is a succinate group. Already you know succinate structure very well from your citric acid cycle. It's kind of a succinate structure right there, right? In the pink. Except that one hydrogen, hydrogen connected to the alpha carbon is now replaced with this arginine type of molecule. So overall, this molecule is known as argininosuccinate. It's nothing but arginine. Look here, you can see that it is an arginine residue, right? And that amine, one of the amine of guanidinium group is actually bound to alpha carbon, what would be succinate. So all this, when these textbook actually go on to shade certain structures, they are supposed to mean to enhance your learning, to actually for you to be able to pay attention to those, so that you don't have to super memorize everything and go crazy. Okay, so argininosuccinate is then produced. And in the third reaction, which is catalyzed by argininosuccinase, you basically produce arginine and fumarate. Remember, trio of reactions will be repeated again and again in metabolic pathways, right? Succinate to fumarate, fumarate to malate, malate to oxaloacetate. Yeah, those reactions. So you are able to produce arginine and fumarate. Fumarate actually leaves the cycle. Oh, that's cool. Because if fumarate leaves the cycle, that's good news, because fumarate can then in cytosol um, um, be converted to, and you will see there is a more fascinating way this fumarate can be utilized either in the cytosol or in the mitochondrial matrix. But you know that fumarate can be converted to malate, right? Malate can be converted to oxaloacetate, and malate to oxaloacetate conversion utilizes NAD plus as the coenzyme, and it produces one molecule of NADH, right? So NADH is good. So fumarate can actually go on and join the citric acid cycle and maybe make molecules of NADH, right? Which will reduce some of the cost associated with the urea cycle. You can see already that, you know, in each round of urea cycle, we are actually formally, you know, the reactions of urea cycle utilizes one molecule of ATP, but urea cycle will not go anywhere if you do not have carbamoyl phosphate, which to produce that molecule, you'll have to consume 2 molecules of ATP in the mitochondrial matrix. So it is a quite energy consuming process, but the good news is that the fumarate that is released can actually give back some of those energy, because if you produce 1 molecule of NADH, it can produce 2.5 molecules of ATP, right? So that's something you should remember. But anyway, arginine, and then arginine will get hydrolyzed with the help of enzyme arginase. Arginase will hydrolyze arginine to produce urea and ornithine. Okay, so if you notice, one molecule, one of the amine in urea is coming directly, right, through carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1. The other one is coming in the form of aspartate, right? So those are the two nitrogen containing functional groups of urea. And you regenerate ornithine. Ornithine can go back and take on another molecule of carbamoyl phosphate and keep on bringing ammonia and producing urea, and urea will get excreted, right? So what to note here? Well, cleavage of argininosuccinate to form fumarate and arginine, right? And if you want to look at the reaction a little bit, you know, how that can happen, look here, argininosuccinate, right? You need to produce fumarate as one of the products. So you need to create a double bond. So it is some kind of an elimination reaction, right? So imagine that the beta carbon here in the pink in argininosuccinate, a general base picks up that proton. And once it picks up that proton, that bond pair will move to create the double bond between the CH2 and alpha carbon. And in that case, this arginine will be the leaving group, the whole molecule of arginine. And therefore, you can produce fumarate and arginine. The only reason I want to, you know, I go over this kind of things again and again in the class is that I'm hoping that you'll actually use pen and pencil and paper and actually write these reactions and see for yourself that you don't have to memorize this, as long as you know some of the key structures like the structure of aspartate and ornithine. All right, so that's the reaction of urea cycle right there. Yeah. All right, so now let's look briefly to nitrogen acquiring reactions that we discussed, right? The first one was catalyzed by carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1. Again, carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1 is not a urea cycle enzyme, formally speaking, but it is needed to produce carbamoyl phosphate that forms the substrate, starting substrate for the urea cycle, right? So in each of these two nitrogen acquiring reactions catalyzed by carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1 and the second one argininosuccinate synthetase, you actually are utilizing ATP molecule. Two ATP molecules in the carbamoyl phosphate synthetase reaction and one ATP molecule in argininosuccinate synthetase catalyzed reaction. So if you look here, it's pretty straightforward, right? You have ATP, a bicarbonate, right? And so bicarbonate will go and attack terminal phosphate group, phosphoryl group, and the leaving group is ADP. And you generate this carbonic phosphoric acid anhydride, right? Ammonia sneaks in, and then ammonia attacks that carbonyl, and phosphate is the leaving group, inorganic phosphate. So ammonia is displacing the phosphoryl group to generate what we call carbamate structure. Carbamate structure is right here. And so then the second molecule of ATP comes in, and again, ADP is the leaving group. So that usually will mean that the attack of that carbonyl oxygen is on the gamma phosphoryl group, right, to generate carbamoyl phosphate. In the reaction of argininosuccinate synthetase, you have the citrulline, right, and citrulline and ATP. Now you see the attack is at a different place. Attack is at the alpha phosphoryl group of ATP. So what they are using is they are using the lone pair of the terminal amino group and pushing it to create the double bond and thereby generating carbonyl oxygen in the form of alkoxide ion, right? And then that attacks the alpha phosphoryl group. Pyrophosphate is the leaving group in this case, and you generate citrulyl AMP intermediate. This is this reaction we are talking about right here. Cool. And then once you have citrulyl AMP intermediate, aspartate is the second substrate, remember, right here in the reaction 2B. It will actually attack that carbonyl carbon and generate AMP is the leaving group, and now you have formed the argininosuccinate. Cool. So yeah, in this case you can see, right, urido oxygen like urea, urido oxygen of citrulline, right, is attacking that alpha phosphoryl group. All right, so let's talk about something that we mentioned in the beginning of the this chapter, which is this aspartate argininosuccinate shunt, or aspartate argininosuccinate shunt cycle pathway, also known as Krebs bicycle. Okay, it turns out that there is connection. Look here at this slide and just look at this and see if you know certain things. I think you know pretty much every reaction as shown here. Okay. You are seeing that this is mitochondrial matrix and there are reactions of citric acid cycles. Not every reaction is shown, but you can see that the citric acid cycle happens in the mitochondrial matrix. You also know that urea cycle, reaction number 1 is in the mitochondrial matrix, but the rest of the 3 reactions are in the cytosol, right? So cytosol, mitochondrial matrix. And so in the second step of urea cycle, you know that aspartate is brought out from the mitochondrial matrix by aspartate malate shuttle, and it reacts with citrulline to generate argininosuccinate, right? And then argininosuccinate actually breaks down into arginine and fumarate. Fumarate in the cytosol. Okay, you know that fumarate is a substrate in the citric acid cycle, right? Fumarate to malate to oxaloacetate, right? So you can pretty much see the reactions here. If you look here, right, look at this reaction which produces aspartate and alpha ketoglutarate. One of the starting material is glutamate, reactant is glutamate, right? What is the other reactant here? And if you carefully think about it, you produce malate to oxaloacetate, right? Using NAD+. That's how you are generating NADH, a high energy molecule that can produce 2.5 molecules of ATP. So oxaloacetate can transaminate with glutamate to generate aspartate and alpha ketoglutarate. That's the reaction that is shown here. So I'm just showing you and getting you to familiarize with the reactions that are shown here. Okay. So it turns out that there is, there is connection between the urea cycle and citric acid cycle. And you can already see how the connection could be, because if you are able to bring fumarate from the cytosol back to citric acids, back to mitochondrial matrix, then you can feed that intermediate into citric acid cycle. Cool. So indeed, and fumarate to malate conversion, right? So fumarases, so there are fumarase and malate dehydrogenase enzyme, right? They have both cytosolic and mitochondrial isoforms. So that means fumarases and malate dehydrogenases are found both in the cytosol and in the mitochondrial matrix. So how that could be helpful? Oh, well, if you need to produce malate in the cytosol, you can use fumarase to convert fumarate to malate, L-malate in the cytosol. But if you need to bring my fumarate back to mitochondrial matrix and replenish maybe depleted fumarate concentration so that citric acid cycle can run effectively, then you can do that. You can actually bring it in and then feed it into the citric acid cycle. So you will be running citric acid cycle as well as you will be running urea cycle reaction. Oh, interesting. So that's why it's called Krebs bicycle or shunt. Aspartate argininosuccinate shunt effectively links the fates of amino groups and carbon skeleton of amino acids. That's what is happening. Okay. And so you can see they call it bicycle, and if you have to maybe tilt your head towards left, and you can see this is the front of the bicycle back, and then it is connected through this aspartate argininosuccinate shunt. Okay. So, these interconnected cycles are called, Krebs bicycle. And the pathway that links the citric acid cycle and urea cycle, which actually links the fates of the amino group and carbon skeleton of the amino acids, that's what aspartate arginine shunt is. And these interconnections, we are not showing all of the enzymes that are involved in this, okay? We just gave you an example of fumarase and malate dehydrogenase, which have both cytosolic isoform and mitochondrial isoform, right? So as a result, you can imagine, as I was saying, fumarate that is produced in the cytosol, whether by the urea cycle or some other pathways, purine biosynthesis or anything like that, it can effectively be converted to cytosolic malate, right? Which, if needed, can be used in the cytosol or can be brought into the mitochondrial matrix via the same aspartate malate shuttle. See, malate is coming in, aspartate is going out of the mitochondrial matrix. There is a shuttle system that actually does this very effectively. We'll talk about that in the last class. So via malate aspartate shuttles, you can actually take the aspartate out, malate comes back in, right? And so, so if you look, formally speaking, right, urea cycle, what happens in urea cycle? If you go back, right, I think its reaction is not shown here, but if you go and look here, right, urea cycle, what does it do? It causes a net conversion, right, of oxaloacetate molecule shown here in the pink to fumarate. Look here outside, right? And that it does via aspartate, right? And so fumarate, as you know, can be converted to oxaloacetate, right? By fumarate will get converted to malate, malate to oxaloacetate. And you know that malate to oxaloacetate conversion, if you recall, malate to oxaloacetate conversion, this 8th step of your urea cycle reaction, you will use NAD+, and in that process, you will generate a molecule of NADH. And you know that each molecule of NADH will produce 2.5 molecules of ATP. So technically, it is able to reduce some of the overall energetic cost of urea synthesis, right? So that's Krebs bicycle or aspartate argininosuccinate shunt. Well, now I think you have memorized your citric acid cycle, so don't need to go there. But I just wanted to show you that you can see this series of reaction quite frequently, right? Succinate to fumarate, fumarate to malate, and malate to oxaloacetate. Okay, so yes, pathway interconnection between urea cycle and citric acid cycle reduces the energetic cost of urea synthesis, right? You need 3 molecules of ATP to make a molecule of urea, right? But you actually also know that urea cycle also causes a net conversion of an oxaloacetate molecule to fumarate, right? And once you make fumarate, you can regenerate oxaloacetate and you can produce a molecule of NADH. And each NADH molecule can go on to generate 2.5 molecules of ATP in the respiratory chain, complex 1, and thereby it reduces the overall energetic cost of urea synthesis. All right, so you must be curious to ask, what is the regulation? How do you regulate urea cycle? It turns out that urea cycle is regulated at the level of enzyme synthesis, which is typically long-term. Okay, so let's say you went on a diet, which is protein-rich diet, right? Only proteins you are eating. Atkins diet, for example. Your expression of your urea cycle enzymes will be upregulated, including the one of carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1. Okay, so you will see higher expression. That will be long-term regulation of urea cycle. But from meal to meal, also the urea cycle is regulated, like short term. And that is typically with the regulation of carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1, the enzyme that actually produces carbamoyl phosphate. Remember, this is a very, very expensive reaction of bicarbonate, ammonia, and ATP to generate carbamoyl phosphate is a very expensive reaction. 2 molecules of ATP are needed. So it makes sense to regulate the activity of this enzyme very carefully, right? So indeed, it happens. There is an allosteric regulation of carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1 for short-term regulation of urea cycle, right? So again, flux of the nitrogen, right, through the urea cycle in us can vary dramatically depending on whether we are eating a protein-rich diet or if we are when we are starving. When we are starving, proteins are utilized as fuel. If you remember, right? Protein in a 70 kilogram individual, almost 100,000 kilojoule energy exists from protein, right? In fact, it's a lot more. It's almost 500,000 kilojoule, but you still have good amount of energy in your proteins, right? So if you're starving, those proteins are utilized as fuel. So, long-term regulation, as I said, is regulated by the expression of 4 urea cycle enzymes, right, and carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1 enzyme in the liver, right? If you are eating a protein-rich diet, you can expect that you'll have much higher expression of these 5 enzymes. Or even when you are starving, like in Ramadan, yeah, you will have higher levels of these enzymes, 5 enzymes in your system. But short-term regulation is by the regulation of carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1. How? It turns out that in the liver there is an enzyme, okay, enzyme called N-acetylglutamate synthase. Synthase. Okay, so it's not using ATP. What N-acetylglutamate synthase does in the liver is that it plays a very important regulatory role to produce a ligand, allosteric ligand, which is N-acetylglutamate. This is an allosteric ligand of carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1. Interesting. Think about beauty here. So N-acetylglutamate synthase produces that allosteric ligand, whose name is N-acetylglutamate, structure shown here in the middle. And N-acetylglutamate is an allosteric ligand of carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1. And it's a positive regulator. Once it is bound at the allosteric site of carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1, it will upregulate the activity of this enzyme. That's why green arrow up. That's what it means. The enzyme that makes that allosteric ligand, right, itself is regulated by the amount of arginine that is present in your blood, in your liver. Basically, liver can sense the nutrients, right? It has the first access to any nutrients you eat. So as soon as you start to bring amino acids into your bloodstream to the liver, you will expect that your arginine concentration will be up, and therefore the activity of N-acetylglutamate synthase will be upregulated, because arginine is a ligand, allosteric ligand for N-acetylglutamate synthase. Think about it, how cool this is regulated, right? So arginine, higher amount of arginine in the liver will activate the enzyme N-acetylglutamate synthase in the liver, which will then catalyze the conversion of acetyl coenzyme A and glutamate to generate N-acetyl glutamate. Once the concentration of N-acetyl glutamate goes up, it will go and bind to carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1 and upregulate its activity, so that more and more amount of carbamoyl phosphate can be generated, so the urea cycle reactions can run at their best, right? So that's the beauty of this regulation. Yeah, so N-acetyl glutamate synthase acts as a regulatory enzyme in our biology. Okay. All right. So that brings us to talking a little bit about amino acids and what are essential amino acids. And I think you know this already. We have briefly mentioned this, right? We cannot synthesize some amino acids. We just do not have the pathways to synthesize certain amino acids. So we must obtain those amino acids in sufficient quantities from our diet, right? So we can make our essential enzymes, essential proteins that we will need to sustain ourselves. So those are called essential amino acids. What are the essential amino acids? Essential amino acids are shown in this table on the right-hand side. And I will never ask you a question in the exam, which is essential amino acid and which is non-essential amino acids. I don't want you to memorize those things. You can look that up. But that essential amino acids are shown here on the right-hand side, and non-essentials are shown here on the extreme left-hand side of the table. And there are some that are conditionally essentials, means sometimes they're required to a certain extent, right, in growing adult or young individuals, or when you are not able to make some of these. But yeah, these are the amino acids that are listed here. Okay. So clearly, there are people, and it's not hard to imagine that if you have any mutations in the enzymes that are involved in production of urea, which means nitrogen excretion, which means we must be able to do that efficiently if you really want to live healthy. If you have any defect, genetic defects, right, any mutations in any of the enzymes involved in the urea cycle, obviously that would mean that you will not be able to tolerate protein-rich diets, right? And think about it. Just think about it. If you're not able to tolerate protein-rich diets, it's a big trouble. Why? Because you will not be able to get some of those essential amino acids from your diet then. Essential amino acids, you must get them from your diet. So a protein-free diet is usually not a treatment option for people who are incapable of carrying out urea cycle, right? So there is a disease called phenylketonuria, PKU, okay? And this is a disease that is, really bad. It's an inherited disease, which basically means that it has to be passed on from your parents, unfortunately, right? Both parents must pass on the defective gene in order for a baby to have this condition. And, God forbid that kind of scenario. And so babies which are born with PKU typically miss one enzyme. Okay, and that enzyme's name is phenylalanine hydroxylase. Now, I'm not telling you because this is supposed to be your homework, but phenylalanine hydroxylase is a very, very important enzyme. Okay, it is needed to break down this essential amino acid phenylalanine right here listed. Okay, and I think it's beyond my lecture, but I will just show you. Okay, phenylalanine metabolism is shown in this slide here. By the way, whatever enzymes are shown here, I'm not going to ask about them in your exam, so don't worry about them. But I'm just asking you to pay attention to phenylalanine hydroxylase enzyme, which is the first enzyme that is involved in the metabolism of phenylalanine, right? But if you look here, and again, it is a little bit of overwhelming for you, I'm sure, but you can see that phenylalanine can be degraded to tyrosine. Oh, okay. So you can make tyrosine. We have the capacity to take phenylalanine and make tyrosine we have that enzyme, phenylalanine hydroxylase. And tyrosine be converted to all these intermediates, and eventually it can be converted to acetoacetate coenzyme A, right? Okay, that can go into, this is one of the intermediate of ketone bodies, right? So it can go on and produce energy in citric acid cycle, for example. So phenylalanine hydroxylase, that's what it does. Basically converts phenylalanine to tyrosine, and it uses molecular oxygen, NADH, and very interesting coenzyme that we'll not talk about, tetrahydrobiopterin. But anyway, so that is the reaction that, cannot happen. So these babies with PKU are missing this enzyme phenylalanine hydroxylase, which would have been needed to break down this phenylalanine. And it turns out that without this enzyme, what happens is that the levels of phenylalanine and two other related molecules, they basically build up in the baby's body, right? And phenylalanine particularly is harmful to the central nervous system, okay, and it can cause brain damage. Yeah, if you have higher levels of phenylalanine in your brain, especially for children, it can cause serious brain damage. Okay, nerve cells in the brain are very sensitive to phenylalanine levels. Okay, so that's what happens. That's really bad. That's what phenylketonuria is. So we hope that someday, with the help of genetic intervention, we can cure this disease, this deadly disease. Okay, so that brings me to discussing what happens to the carbon portion of the molecule, right? You already know this a little bit, but I still want to show you. So how does amino acid catabolism lead into the pathways for energy production? It turns out that all 20 common natural amino acids are oxidatively degraded by 20 different pathways to produce just 6 metabolic intermediates, in some case 7, but ignore 7 for now. Okay, so ketogenic amino acids can be converted to ketone bodies, right? So here are the 7 amino acids that will get converted to acetyl coenzyme A: leucine, isoleucine, threonine, lysine, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan. If you recall, there are some of these are both ketogenic and glucogenic, right? You remember 3 amino acids: tryptophan, tyrosine, phenylalanine, threonine, and isoleucine. They are both ketogenic and glucogenic, which means their carbon skeleton can be converted to ketone bodies like acetyl coenzyme A type of molecules, or an intermediate that can be utilized to make new glucose molecules like pyruvate and succinyl CoA, fumarate, oxaloacetate. Leucine and lysine, if you remember, are exclusively ketogenic. So they, of course, will be producing acetyl coenzyme A. Glucogenic amino acids shown here are converted to one of these intermediates that can be utilized to produce new glucose molecule via gluconeogenesis. Cool? You already know this. So, can we put this all in the context? And that's what is shown here. Okay. All of these 20 catabolic pathways, they converge to form only 6 major products, all of which enter the citric acid cycle, right? So shown here in the pink are glucogenic amino acids. The blue is ketogenic. So you can see that arginine, glutamine, histidine, and proline, when they are metabolized, their carbon portion goes on to get converted to glutamate. Then glutamate will get converted to alpha ketoglutarate, right? And then it goes on to feed into the citric acid cycle. Isoleucine, methionine, threonine, and valine will make succinyl coenzyme A. Phenylalanine and tyrosine, they will make fumarate. Aspartate, asparagine, they will make oxaloacetate. Once you have oxaloacetate, you can of course utilize oxaloacetate to make new glucose molecule via gluconeogenesis. Some of these amino acids here, alanine, cysteine, glycine, serine, threonine, tryptophan, they can make pyruvate. Pyruvate are potentially also ketogenic because pyruvate dehydrogenase can convert pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A. So pyruvate can go on to convert acetyl coenzyme A or can get converted to oxaloacetate. Remember pyruvate carboxylase reaction? Yeah. So those are the listed here. Yeah, and some you'll notice that some amino acids are listed more than once because different parts of their carbon skeletons are degraded to different kinds of end products. Cool? All right. So I couldn't have gone and finished this chapter without showing you at least one catabolic pathways for two of the simplest amino acids, which is acine and aspartate. Okay. Turns out that both acine and aspartate are converted to oxaloacetate. How? You can see that asparagine is shown here on the top. So there is an enzyme called asparaginase that will take asparagine and hydrolyze it using water to generate ammonia and aspartate. Aspartate will then can get easily converted to oxaloacetate by aspartate aminotransferase reaction using pyridoxal phosphate, right? So both of these amino acids end up as oxaloacetate. They have missed their color codes here. Oxaloacetate can be glucogenic, right? Is it glucogenic? And so that's where the chapter ends. And we will not be discussing some of these other reactions in this class because it's just another enzyme, another intermediate. Okay, so let's stop our class here, but you can always go and refer to the textbook if you need to look up the catabolism of any particular amino acids. Thank you, and let me see here.